Dawn came in layers, pearl first, then rose, spreading across the marsh flats and touching every blade of cordgrass with a tremble of light. Rosa stood barefoot on the plank walkway that ran from the rice shed to the skiff dock and watched a heron sift forward, leg by patient leg, like a needle finding its stitch. The air held two smells at once, brine and smoke, the old breath of the bay and the night's hush of coals. She breathed both and tried to measure the day by them, as if they were marks cut in a measuring stick no one else could see. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. The rope in her hands felt friendly. It was river rope, hemp with a long twist, stained with pitch from the shipyard upriver, where the Caldwell brothers sent their tall barrels and took their profit from other people's backs. Rosa worked that rope the way she worked every hour, quiet-faced and listening, fingers moving from habit, attention divided into thin, useful threads. She stretched the line, checked the lay, then folded one overhand knot into another until a small eye sat in her palm like a thought completed. She was supposed to be mending a net, but she had not brought the net. The excuse, if anyone asked, was that the rope in the net barrel had mildewed. The truth was, she preferred the heft and order of rope to the bruised chaos of net. Nets demanded apology. Rope demanded care. Care had been her way to live. Care of cooking fires, care of garden rows, care of words that no one guessed she could read. After lights out in the quarter-house, she would sit at the table edge with a burnt matchstick and a scrap of paper scavenged from the barrel where Whit Caldwell's wife threw the mercantile bills and city broadsides. She traced letters in the scorched wood and laid her finger along the shapes. O, E, A. Each one a small round promise, a door. The first time she read a word whole, it had been a brand stamped on a flour sack, and it had struck her like a bell. Pillsbury. The second time had been her own name in a ledger. Rosa, listed in a hand that looked like pickets along a fence. She had run her finger over that word until the ash came off under her nail. The Caldwells were a set of three brothers who believed the world was a table laid for them. Whit, the youngest and master of the house at the Bay Plantation. Silas, who kept the inland fields and came down every month with wagons and whiskey talk. And Abram, the one with a voice like a wet log catching fire. Sudden, loud, and choking. There had been a fourth, Jacob, but Jacob had died in a fever, and the living brothers carried him forward as a complaint against God and the world, a door-knocker they hit again and again so the house of time would open and let him back in. It never did. They made do with what they had, their land, their profit, and their habits. Rosa had another habit. She kept account, privately, in a small sewn book hidden inside the rung of a chair in the washroom where she laundered the family linen. She had pried the rung open with a thin-bladed spoon years before and found the hollow inside smooth as a breath. In the sewn book, on paper cut from the edges of broadsheets and surplus invoices, she made her lists. Not the lists she was asked to write, kitchen cupboard tallies, salt pork, rice, lamp oil, but a different kind. Names of the beaten, names of the sold, names of the children pulled away like weeds. She wrote them carefully, in a hand that grew out of the ghost of her finger tracing ash. She did not add Jacob Caldwell's name to this account. Jacob was dead by fever. The others breathed. The morning's work should have been easy. Fetch cords, mend nets, begin the cleaning of the gutting tables after last night's mullet run. But the night had brought more than fish. After dark, Rosa had been called into the main house to bring hot water and cloth for Whit's wife, Mary Ann, who had been entertaining a minister from Spring Hill. They spoke in the parlor about righteousness, while the bay wind pressed the magnolia leaves against the shutter like a listening hand. Rosa stood outside the door and let the words come to her in pieces. Providence, order, duty. Then came Whit's remark, tossed in a voice so mild she almost missed the blade beneath it. We're sending Ruthie inland with Silas next week. Mary Ann thinks it best. Ruthie was 6 and fell asleep against Rosa's side every night with one hand buried in Rosa's pocket. She had a narrow scar at the corner of her mouth from when she had tried to drink soup straight from the pot and Rosa had lifted her away too slow. When Rosa heard that sentence, "We're sending Ruthie," she felt the rope in her hands then as she felt it now, fibers with a memory. She saw Ruthie's hand sliding out of her pocket and not coming back. By morning, she had made a decision that did not feel like a decision. It felt like stepping into a room she had already built, plank by plank, in her own mind. She went first to the rice shed and looked at the inventory chalked on the board by the door. She wiped away the chalk for 2 sacks of rough rice and wrote 3. Then she took a length of rope from the wall and slipped it under her apron. She tied and untied as she walked. Reef knot, bowline on a bight, clove hitch, slipped, unslipped, until each knot sat in her palm like a small sentence she could speak in the dark. "Rosa!" Zeph, who worked the yard team, stood by the skiff with oars in his hands and a question pinned under his eyebrows. He did not say more. Questions had weight and sound. He knew to carry neither. "I'll bring the mullet boards up," she said, and moved past him to the low dock. The water shivered against the pilings. Across the bay, Mobile lay in a soft haze where the river met the salt, ships like black knives held up by invisible fingers. She had learned that city by its smells and by the letters that named them: TAR, salt, coffee, cotton. There were words the broadsides used that she would not write in her book, market words that carried other people's breath in them, their grief rubbed into the ink so deep you could feel it with your fingertip. The plan was not a single act, but a line of them, each laid over the last until a braid formed. Rosa could braid in her sleep. Her mother had taught her with sweetgrass when Rosa was small enough to stand between her mother's knees and feel the working hands as a kind of weather. But a braid of axe had to look like ordinary work. It had to lie still on a table while someone's eye slid over it and didn't catch. First, she went to the smokehouse. The door hung on a strap hinge, and when it swung, it spoke a tired old syllable, "Ugh," that Rosa had heard all her life. The unlit wood still smelled of hickory, and the soot on the rafters made the air feel like she was already inside a throat. She looked up at the rafters and measured span and drop. She had learned measures from quilting and from the yard's carpenter, a free black man named Isaiah, who came twice a year and drank his coffee out by the well where the shade was always reluctant. Isaiah had taught her that rafters were only long ribs holding a body of weather up, and what held them together was opinion as much as wood. She found 2 she trusted and tied a line around them that could be worked blind if it had to be. Second, she went to the barrel shed where the hoop iron was kept and loosened one binding on a slack barrel so that it would creak when moved. Not enough to fail, only enough to speak. Third, she went to the stable and slipped a small carved token, a bird with a broken wing, into the crack behind the left stall. Saffron's sign. Saffron was midwife and maker of quiet arrangements. The token told Saffron to meet at the old live oak by the brick kiln at dusk. Fourth, Rosa went to the kitchen where the day's orders already lay like fallen branches. Churn, scald, knead, boil. Marianne Caldwell sat with a list in her lap and a fret in her voice. "Rosa, see that the house is aired after luncheon. The minister found the parlor close, and the silver must be polished before supper. Silas is expected." Her eyes flicked to Rosa's hands, to the rope burn she kept as a bracelet around her wrist. "That rope looks unsightly. Is there not enough to do without playing with cord like a sailor?" Rosa smiled a small, obedient smile. "Yes, ma'am." She set the rope in the basket of laundry, under a wimple of linen. She kept the knots she had tied in her head, their shapes cool and hard as slate. By noon the heat pressed everything level. The yard dogs slept with their paws twitching. Whit rode out with Zeph to look at a section of the levee that always wanted to go back to being river. Rosa cleaned the mullet boards and fixed the knife handles where the tangs had swollen with damp. She worked in the shade, her back to the open yard so that no one could read her face. The sound of a wagon on Shell Road came faint at first, then present. Silas. Silas Caldwell was a man who looked like his own dog, narrow head, pale eyes, a habit of going still before he moved. He wore a suit without dust on it, which meant he had ridden standing in the wagon or had stopped and brushed himself before turning into the yard, vanity in service of the first impression. He was older than Whit by 10 years and wore his age like a ribbon he kept trying to pin to other people. They greeted each other with brother words.
Rosa heard them without listening. What she listened for was small: Silas's cough, the faint whistle it dragged behind it, the rut of his boot heels smaller on the left, the squeak from the slack hoop she had loosened, a planned sound that came now at the edge of the world and made her chest fill with something that was almost laughter. The barrel did not fail. It spoke, and then held. "Rosa!" Whit called, his tone the tone he kept for tools. "Supper will be early. Silas needs to ride at dawn." "Yes, sir."
Rosa went to the kitchen to begin the dance of heat and timing. Marianne gave orders in a fluttering way that made the hours break and scatter. Rosa gathered them up. She prepped the hens with salt and lemon and stitched the skin closed with twine so it would roast plump. She set cornmeal to soak. She rolled dough for pie. As she worked, she slid a folded scrap under the kitchen door with the heel of her hand. Jonas would come for wood. He would see it. He would carry it in his boot heel to Saffron. The scrap said only, "Ruthie. Tonight, oak." It was not the way Rosa preferred to write, but time had shut its hand around this day, and she had to slide between its fingers. In the afternoon light that makes every splinter look gilded, Rosa took Ruthie to the pump and washed her hair. The child stood patient, chin lifted, trusting Rosa to keep the water out of her eyes. Rosa pressed her palm against the small skull and felt the soft place that had grown bone and remembered. Ruthie hummed the tune of a hymn that had traveled through 100 throats to reach her. Rosa hummed with her and added words under her breath that Ruthie would not understand as words, only as river and tree and go. "Do you know Mobile?" Rosa asked casually, rinsing. "I know the tall church," Ruthie said, "and the man who sells sweets in the market and shouts." "The market has more than sweets." Rosa let the water run away and wrapped the child's head in a cloth. "If you go there, you hold a hand and you look up for tall swallows over the roof. They always come back to their mud nests, always. Even if somebody takes the nest, they build again," Rosa said. Then she knelt and held Ruthie's face between the towel edges and looked into those eyes she had lifted out of sleep 100 times. "Do you understand me?" Ruthie nodded as if she did, which was enough. Evening lowered itself carefully. The live oak by the brick kiln had stood through fires and storms and the changing of old roads. Saffron waited beneath it with her basket. Saffron's hands were cracked, as if someone had written a story all over them with a sharp reed. Jonas stood with his thumb hooked under his belt, looking like he was merely resting his feet before walking back to the slave quarters. But his eyes were turned the way a fisherman's eyes turn just before the cork bobs sideways. "Ruthie," Rosa said, and the name was not explanation, but a wire pulled tight between them. Saffron nodded once. "When?" "Silas rides at dawn. He sleeps in the front room tonight. The door has a latch that will sit quiet if you touch it with a brass is worn. He will not carry his boots to bed. He thinks the world will carry him." Jonas looked toward the house, then back to Rosa. "You sure of your hand?" He did not say knot. He did not say rope. Rosa looked at her hands. They were not large hands. They were hands that could shape dough and stop a child from falling and keep the fire at the exact thin blue it needed to be to pull sweetness from onion. She closed them once and opened them. "Yes." Saffron's mouth tightened as if tasting something bitter that had to be swallowed anyway. "There are ways to send Ruthie that do not require blood." "There are ways that do," Rosa said, and heard the quiet in her own voice. "Whit's brothers keep his courage for him. You cut the cords a man ties his fear to, he falls. Whit will sign papers if he is alone with his fear. He will believe God told him to be merciful." Saffron looked down at her basket, then up. "I will have a fever brew ready for Marianne come morning. Fevers make signatures." She paused. "You cannot unknot what you mean to tie tonight." Rosa thought of her sewn book and the list of names. She thought of adding a different kind of name and how the pen would feel colder in her hand after. I know. They made their smaller arrangements. Jonas would be in the yard under the kitchen eave. Saffron would watch for lights in the upstairs rooms. Ruthie would sleep with her shoes on. The night fell the way night falls when it has work to do. Supper went the way suppers go when men want the food to prove their power. Silas told stories about a planter upriver who had hanged a man for stealing a nail. Marianne widened her eyes in a way that meant she wanted to be known as kinder than that. Whit laughed in a way that meant he recognized himself in the story and did not like what he saw, so he covered it with noise. Rosa poured wine and took away Bones and watched the room with the inside corner of her attention, the part that sees the moth land on the mantel and the spider in the crown molding lift one leg. When the table cleared and the men went to the veranda to smoke, Rosa went to the washroom and pulled the sewn book from the chair rung. She opened to the last page with space on it and wrote 2 new lines without names attached, just a date and a word she did not often write where anyone might see. Choice. Then she slid the book back into its hollow, washed her hands, and carried cool water to the porch. Silas coughed the cough she had heard in the yard, the whistle threading through it like a small reed pipe. "Damn this bay," he said cheerfully. "Air like soup and mosquitoes big enough to saddle." He slapped at his neck. His finger came away with a smear of blood. "You might at least drain your swamps, Whit." "God drains what he pleases," Whit said piously. Rosa set the water down and saw the line of Silas's throat as he tipped the glass, saw the muscles swim under the skin like fish. She felt her hands grow still at her sides. They sat late. The minister had left after supper, carrying his righteousness like a lantern held high so it would not get smoke on it. Marianne went early to bed with a rose-water cloth on her forehead. The house settled into the rhythm Rosa knew. The long exhale of the chimney, the tick and pop of old boards remembering sun after dark. Ruthie lay on the pallet with her shoes on, as promised. Rosa sat beside her until the child's breath fell into the pattern that meant her body had gone soft as a loaf of bread cooling. She smoothed the hairline that had seemed so perilous when Ruthie was a baby, the thin place that had grown its cover of bone. She kissed the air above it. Then she stood. The rope lay coiled in the basket under the folded linen. She lifted it and let it fall once, soft, measuring the sound. In the smokehouse that afternoon she had tied her practice knots high where no one would see. Now she made 2 loops and held them in her left hand, while her right hand opened and closed on the working end the way a heart opens and closes on blood. She walked a path she had walked in her thoughts in the hours since morning. Through the corridor past the library door. Across the back parlor where the grand piano sat like a black ship in harbor. Into the front hall where the lamplight made islands on the floor. Silas had chosen the front room because it faced the bay and because men like Silas preferred to be seen by the first light that arrives anywhere. The door was imperfect. Old wood, old brass, a latch that knew enough not to cry out if touched where the wear had taught it silence. She touched it there. The door breathed, no other word for it, and eased from its frame. He did not sleep. She had known he might not. Men who carry themselves like a standard keep a piece of themselves on watch even when they close their eyes. He lay with the sheet across his hips and his shirt unbuttoned 2 buttons down, which was vanity. He wanted to wake in his own story already composed. His boots stood where he had taken them off, toes out, heels together, like soldiers. His coat hung from the chair. His pistol sat on the nightstand with extra care, as if he had thought about where to put it and wanted someone to notice. Rosa closed the door behind her and let the dark be kind. The window was open an inch, and a bay laid its wet hand on the room. Silas coughed once and turned his face toward the sound of the door settling. "Who's there?" Rosa could have answered in any number of voices, and all of them would have belonged to her. Kitchen voice, yard voice, child voice, field voice. She did not answer. She crossed the rug on the balls of her feet. The rope in her hands was only rope. There are no wicked tools, Isaiah had said once, fitting a new hinge to a door. A tool does what a hand tells it to do. Silas reached for the pistol. That movement gave her the last small permission she had been waiting for without knowing it. She was close enough to smell him. Peppery cologne, sweat, the ghost of some bitter bark tincture he took for the cough. She moved the way a good seamstress moves when she sets a last stitch, sure, quick, prepared by every other stitch taken. The loop slid over his head, and her knee found the edge of the bed frame for purchase. He made the sound a big fish makes in a net when it feels the narrowing of its world and decides to thrash. His hand found the pistol and then could not find the trigger because his own body had forgotten which parts belonged to fighting and which belonged to breath. She leaned back into the rope. There was a way to pull that was about power and another that was about knowledge. She chose knowledge. She kept the pull steady so that the old boards in the house would not wake and tell on her. She did not speak. The first word she would say, afterward, would be Ruthie's name. Silas's boots were not on his feet. He kicked anyway, heels striking the bedpost, a hollow drumbeat. In another part of the house a door moved and settled. The bay wind pressed water laughter against the sill. Rosa counted under her breath the way she counted dough turns. 1, 2, 3. She did not need to count higher, but she did. 4, 5, 6. The rope taught her the last lesson. How many heartbeats fit inside a single decision? She held until his hands stopped trying to be wings. She held until the pistol slid off the sheet and met the rug with a sound like an apology, felt rather than heard. She held until his chest forgot its argument. Then she eased the pull so the ropes would not rebound and speak.
She did not feel triumph. She felt a door open inside her that she had known was there because she had built it, but had never planned to step through, except in thought. Now she had stepped. The room did not change. The bay still laid its wet hand. The board still kept counsel. Rosa worked quickly. She fitted the rope so it would look like a man who had tried to sit up too fast and met a piece of his own furniture. She straightened the pistol on the nightstand. She wiped the chair back where her skirt had brushed it with the cloth she had brought for that purpose and would burn. She stood and looked at the bed and at the man in it and added a new line in her head to the sewn book. Not a name, another word she seldom wrote. Act. She slipped out, eased the latch into the sweet place where it lay down like a tired animal, and walked the same path back through the house. Jonah stood in the darkness under the kitchen eave. He did not ask. She did not tell. She put the cloth into his hand. He would burn it with scraps behind the smokehouse and stir the ash into the path where it would make gray islands that looked like old rain. In the quarter-house, Ruthie slept in her shoes. Saffron sat on the stool by the door with her basket and her tired story hands and looked at Rosa in a way that meant she had counted something too. Dawn, Saffron said. Dawn, Rosa said back. She lay down beside Ruthie for an hour and watched the slot of window show her first black, then violet, then pearl. Then she rose and went to the kitchen to stir the first fire and boil coffee and set bread to rise, as if the world had not moved its weight. She waited for the sound that would come, men waking to their own story and finding it changed. It came like any sound comes in a house. That is to say, folded into other sounds. A step in the front hall. A door that did not quite know how to be a door if the breath behind it had stopped. Wit's voice calling, then not calling, then making the kind of noise that has no word printed under it in any book. Rosa kept the coffee from boiling over and wiped the counter and steadied her breathing, which wanted to match Wit's. She had to keep the kitchen heartbeat regular. Other hearts would gallop today. Marian came down the back stairs white-lipped and unwilling to be seen in her nightdress. She put on a shawl of propriety and stood in the doorway. "What is it?" She waited for the world to tell her that it had not happened. Whit tried to gather himself into a shape that could speak to a woman and not to a door or a wind or God. He said, "Silas. Silas is—" He did not finish. He never finished anything if there was a way to avoid it. Rosa set a cup of coffee down where a hand might find it and steadied the cream pitcher even though no one had touched it. She stood like any kitchen woman stands when the house's upstairs roof caves in, ready to make eggs, toast, excuses. Inside, she lifted the small door she had opened the night before and looked through it at the shape of the world on the other side. It did not look like freedom. It looked like work. The coroner came from town in a buggy that acted like a stubborn cow. He was a man with hair too black and a pencil that he fidgeted when he listened because he did not want to fidget the parts of himself that felt things. He looked at the bed. He looked at Silas's throat and the bedpost. He looked at the pistol that lay in correct place like a student with his hands folded. "Too much drink, perhaps," he said to Whit, who seized the phrase like a rope thrown to a drowning man and tied it around his chest. Silas overdid it. Whit told Marianne, told the yardman, told himself. Silas was careless. He said it twice with a different stress each time, as if two men named Silas existed and each deserved the blame. Men came and went. Saffron brewed fever draft for Marianne, who lay on the fainting couch with one forearm over her eyes. Jonas kept the yard moving so that the movement would look like reason. Rosa built plates of food no one would eat because everyone needed something to hold. Ruthie stood in the corner with her hands behind her back, as if that would keep her from being taken. By afternoon, the house had a new shape. It leaned slightly towards something it had not leaned toward before. Whit walked around with his shoulders tipped up like a man pulling a coat tighter. He spoke of providence, of warning, of prudence. He did not speak of Ruthie. Rosa did not speak either. She watched his eyes move when he looked at the child, as if looking at the sun through a piece of smoked glass.
In the evening, after the men from town had gone and Silas lay in the parlor under a sheet, not because he was honored, but because there was no place else, Whit sat at his desk and took out paper and pen. He began to write a letter to Abram. Rosa did not need to see to know the words, sorrow, unexpected, come. She set a plate on the desk because men write better if they think someone has fed them. Then she turned and went to the washroom and took the sewn book from its hollow. She opened it and wrote another word, not on the list of the beaten or the sold, but in the space she had kept for what the world does after it is moved. Movement. She found Jonas at the back step and said, "Tonight." He nodded, only that. Saffron would meet them by the oak at moonrise. Ruthie would be ready to be a swallow. The bay would open its black road. But the world is not a road anyone can draw with a straight edge. As Rosa stepped into the yard with the child's hand inside her palm and the night soaked full of crickets, a wheel ground shell on the road earlier than any moonrise meeting. A buggy came fast enough to throw sparks, and in it a man whose voice carried ahead like a smell. Abram Caldwell had not waited for his brother's letter to find him. He came hot with long miles and the belief that any door would open for him before he reached it. "Whit!" he shouted, even before the wheels stopped. "Whit!" His boots hit the shell, his hand hit the brass of the knocker, his shoulder hit the door as if doors were things that needed reminding what opening was for. He pushed into the house with his hat still on and grief already coiled into anger because it traveled easier that way. Rosa pulled Ruthie back into the shadow by the kitchen wall. She felt the child's tremor come up through bone. She laid her hand over the small chest and counted to steady what she could steady. 1, 2, 3. Abram's voice filled the front rooms the way water fills a ditch that has been waiting. "What happened?" he demanded. And then, without waiting for the answer, because men like Abram ask questions to throw them at the world, not to catch what comes back. I told him to stop smoking in bed, fool. I told him. He kept talking as grief took aim at something easier than God. Wit tried to shepherd him toward the parlor and the sheet and the story the coroner had printed in pencil on his face, too much drink. Abram shook him off. "Where's the girl?" he said suddenly. "Where's the little one? Silas had business with her. Where's the girl?" Rosa felt Ruthie's breath catch and stay. She moved her body the way you move a boat across a current. Angle, weight, patience. She edged them toward the milk shed, then toward the path past the brick kiln. Jonas at the edge of shadow shifted 1 foot. Abram's boot heels turned, hard, toward the back of the house. The sound came like thrown stones, sharp and regular. He was not a man who moved quietly through any world. He did not believe the world had anything in it that deserved quiet. The back door latch lifted. Rosa stepped into the milk shed and set Ruthie behind the cool shape of a churn. She wrapped the rope around her hands because her hands needed something to tell them where to be, and because a tool does what a hand tells it to do. And because some doors, once opened, do not close until you tie them shut yourself. The latch rose the last half-inch. The door began to swing and spill light across the floor. She drew breath, felt the bay lay its wet hand on the back of her neck, and pulled the line tight.
This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. The word cinched in Rosa's mind as surely as hemp around a post. The milk shed's door swung wider under Abram Caldwell's hand, light knifing across the packed earth floor and silvering the churn and shelves. His hat brim cut a moon out of the square of brightness. Rosa stepped sideways, angling the rope through her palms, letting the night's damp keep the fibers quiet. Ruthie's breath, small and bird-quick, trembled against the churn. "A rat in here?" Abram said to the dark, because men like Abram preferred to speak first, so the world would have to answer in his key. "I smell milk." Rosa steadied her stance the way a skiff steadies when another boat's wake runs under it. "Sir," she said from shadow, shaping her mouth around the house voice he expected. "Just cooling cream." He let the door swing inward the rest of the way. His silhouette thickened, his boots scuffed. The brass latch settled with a click that felt like a pebble dropped in Rosa's throat. He stepped in, 1 pace, 2, and then his eyes came to the rope in Rosa's hands, because the rope carried its own meaning even when coiled. "What's that for?" he said, more curious than afraid. Abram had always assumed fear belonged to other people. "For tying the cream cloths," Rosa answered, shifting her grip. The rope lay slack, an innocent line draped from hand to hand. Behind the churn, Ruthie's shoes creaked. Rosa breathed in the smell of cream and damp wood and Abram's travel sweat, and knew that one movement would braid these smells into memory forever. "Where's the girl?" he said, turning his head toward the sound he had half heard. "Silas had arrangements." Arrangements. The word hit the soft place in Rosa's chest where she kept patience like a candle. It guttered once and then rose. "She's asleep," Rosa said, and heard the calm in her own voice, a river over stones. "House is grieving. Best not to wake children to it." Abram stepped again. The rope rose in Rosa's hands without seeming to. She did not plan to repeat a night's work exactly. A path walked once is not the same path a second time. She needed him away from the doorway, past the churn, under the beam that groaned when the weather changed. She needed the milk shed to be a witness that would not speak. "Stand aside," Abram told her, and reached, not for the rope, not for Ruthie, but for the churn, as if he might use it to steady what little patience he had for being told no. Rosa gave way by half a step and then by none. He came close enough that his breath laid itself on her cheek, the sourness of tobacco and road. His hand brushed the rope and did not read its language. He lifted his chin to look past her. That movement gave her the angle Isaiah had taught without ever teaching.
Leverage is only the study of angles that the world has hidden in plain sight. She didn't throw the loop, she raised it and laid it soft as a shawl, and then drew the slack home with a gardener's tug. Abram made a sound like the hinge when it wants oil. He brought his hands up, but not fast, because surprise is a chain that wraps a moment twice before breaking. Rosa shifted her weight, heels set, hips back, shoulders low. She thought of dough, of how it yields under steady pressure, and of the lesson rope had taught her the night before. Do not pull for noise, pull for knowledge. It was quicker, and it was harder. Abram's hands were rougher than Silas's, and he carried his strength like a rung he could grab anytime he needed to climb. He grabbed at the rope, at her wrists, at his own collar, anything that could be made into a handle on breath. The churn rocked, the cream shushed against oak. Ruthie's tremor traveled up the air. "Let him go," a voice whispered inside her that sounded like the part of a person that wants the world to bend without being asked. Rosa marked that voice and set it aside like a spoon too hot to hold. She did not let go. She did not speak. She leaned and held and counted 1, 2, 3, until the counting lengthened and the fight went out of his hands like tide leaving a flat. When he sagged, she eased, not with mercy, but with care. Tools leave marks. Care chooses where. She shifted the rope so that the story the room would tell in morning light would be one men could believe because it suited them. A stumble, a strike, a man not master of himself. She wiped where his hand had raked the churn. She set the lid true. Jonas was already in the doorway because he had heard what the world does when it changes shape. He did not ask. He looked at Ruthie, who stood with her fists pressed to her mouth as if she could push her sounds back where they belonged. "Go," she said to Rosa, voice like a hand closing a gate gently. "Take the swallow to the oak. Saffron is waiting. I'll set the room the way rooms want to be set when men read them with their eyes closed." Rosa nodded. She loosened the rope and coiled it as if it had been used for creamcloths and not for the tilt of a world. She took Ruthie's hand, small and damp, and they slipped into the yard. The night wind carried bay salt and a far-off bell from a ship on the river. The stars had their unbothered brightness, the kind that makes a person feel both seen and ignored. Beneath the live oak, Saffron waited with the basket that always had more in it than a body could see. Ruthie crawled into her skirts like a kit finding a den. "It's done," Rosa said. She did not shape it into a question or apology. Saffron's mouth went to a thin line that did not judge. "Then we move with that truth, not against it." She took out a cloth packet. "Bread, jerked fish, a veil of laudanum if a fever we need arrives. A scrap with a name in Mobile who can forget his own name if necessary." She touched Ruthie's head. Then Rosa's wrist where the rope burn showed like a bracelet. "You still mean to go to the city?"
Rosa looked toward the line of water, darker than the land because it was honest about what it swallowed and what it let go. "I mean to carry Ruthie there and come back. Wit will sign if he stands alone long enough with his fear." Saffron nodded, slow. "Then you'll need a boat that does not mind being told what to do." Zeph, who could make a skiff answer a whisper, slid out from the black edge of the kiln. "Tide's right," he said. "Wind slants. We can ride the left-hand cut where the marsh stands like men with their backs turned." They moved as people move when each step has been practiced in the mind, not rushing, not dawdling, attending to the small sounds, the whick of cordgrass, the slap of a fish, the rasp of a heron's feet on a piling. Rosa carried Ruthie into the skiff and set her between her knees. Ruthie's head pressed to Rosa's stomach as if listening for a drum. Zeph pushed them off with a pole. The skiff glided into a channel so narrow it felt like a thought held between teeth. Behind, the plantation's windows made small square stars. Ahead, the bay opened into its old, patient darkness.
Rosa kept her face turned toward the wind so Ruthie could hide against her and still breathe. She counted Zeph's strokes, not because she needed to, but because counting held the hands steady when they wanted to shake after the body has done something it cannot undo. She thought of the sewn book and the words she had written, choice, act, movement, and wondered what word would come next when ink met paper. Consequence, perhaps, or tide. Mobile rose out of the dark like a story somebody had been telling on the other side of a door. Lamps by the river, a bell swinging its iron vowel, the smell of tar and coffee and cotton that she had learned to read before she had the shape of letters. The skiff slid under the shadow of a hull fat with cargo. Zeph tucked them into a little pocket of water behind a wharf piling. "Dawn's not far," he said. "You go when the market breathes in and noise gives you cover. I'll wait with the skiff where the nets hang to dry." Rosa put her hand on his shoulder. "If we don't come, you must not wait. A waiting boat calls the world's eye." Zeph nodded once, a boatman's yes. They went ashore in the least official way, feet on pilings, breath held, a last stretch over a gap that showed the bay down below like a listening ear. Saffron scrap with the name on it lay against Rosa's palm. Tyree Fletcher, Cooper. She did not know Tyree except as a rumor Saffron trusted, a man who could make a barrel so true it floated empty with the bung out, and who could keep a child in the dark of his shop longer than a storm. The market woke. It woke the way animals wake, one stall at a time, a rustle, a cough, a laugh too loud, a word repeated until it became permission to speak. Rosa moved through the crowd with Ruthie's hand in her pocket where it belonged. She kept to the edges where the fish scales made a glitter like a mean kind of snow. The cooperage lay 2 streets inland, marked by a hoop of iron on a post, and the smell of green wood being taught to be circles. Tyree Fletcher had a face like a barrel stave, curved not by softness, but by design. He looked up when the bell in his door made its small announcement. His eyes took Rosa's measure fast, and Ruthie's measure faster. He did not look away from either. "Tea?" he said, as if she had come for something ordinary. "I got a little on the boil for a cough I pretend I have." Rosa lifted saffron scrap, not to show the name, but to show the trust that had written it. Tyree nodded as if Rosa and Tyree had been having a conversation for years that had finally reached a point where it could be useful. "Here then," he said, "I got a half-barrel needs staving. It can take as long as it needs." He bent and lifted the trap in the floor with 2 fingers and an old groan. A smell of old wood and river drifted up. "It's cooler down there than a river rock, and it minds its own business." Ruthie's hand tightened. Rosa knelt. "A swallow knows how to slide under a roof eave when the hawk is out. You'll be a swallow until I tell you different." "I'll hear you," Ruthie whispered back. "You'll feel me in your hand." And she pressed their fingers together until the touch made a little bone knowledge that would last. Tyree lowered the child into the dark with a gentleness that made itself invisible. The trap shut. He set a barrel over the place, not to hide it, but to make the floor show only what the floor had always shown. He poured Rosa a cup of the tea he'd pretended he'd made for himself. "You look like somebody who has put her hand in a hive and come away with what she needed," he said, hands easy around his cup. "You hurt?" Rosa shook her head, "Not in the places that show." "Then do your business while I do mine," he said, and turned to his bench where a hoop lay that needed persuading. Her business was paper. Paper lives in offices where men call other men by their last names until they sound like tools. Pratt, Weaver, Mills. Paper lives in courthouses where pens scratch out fate like grocery lists. Rosa did not need a manumission.
She needed a promise that a child would be placed quietly in a house whose windows faced a lane so narrow 2 wagons could not pass. She needed the man who kept that list. The clerk was a man whose senses had all been turned down so he could survive the noise that paper makes when it takes a life in hand. He looked up when Rosa entered and let his eyes slide away because the world had taught him that looking hard at certain people made the day longer than it needed to be.
"I need a name on the Fisher list," Rosa said before he could make her into a piece of furniture and pass around her. "Fisher?" he said, and his voice did not believe she had the right to say it. The Fisher list was what people called the set of households where orphans were placed by ladies with shawls and by ministers with keys to cupboards. "Yes," she said, "a girl of 6. She needs a place for 3 nights. After that, she will have kin." The clerk made his pencil's point by licking it. "No names," he said automatically. I did not bring a last name. I brought a child." He looked at her then because the words had made him. He saw her rope burn. He saw the steadiness she wore like a shawl. He saw that a person can be made into a door that swings one way unless you lay a hand on it just so, and then it swings the other. "What house?" he said, because even a small resistance has to tuck itself into a plausible drawer. "Mrs. Albemarle on Church Street," Rosa said. She had chosen the name because Saffron Scrap had carried it in a list of good places next to bad ones. The clerk nodded because her choice made his work easier. Women like Mrs. Albemarle wrote notes in neat hand and paid on time. He dipped and wrote, "1 child, 3 nights, no questions." He pushed the paper to her and then took it back because that was the script. "I'll carry it," he said, and stood to make the errand into kindness. Rosa did not go with him. She went back to Tyrese Cooperage and put her palm flat on the barrel over the trap. She felt below, the thump of her own blood, the small, alive thing that was Ruthie's patience. "I'll come for you by dark," she said into the wood. "You will ride a quiet road into a quiet house and sleep with clean sheets that smell like soap." Tyree's hoop settled around a barrel with a sound like a man deciding to stay married. "You going back?" he said, not as a question. "Yes." Rosa looked at her hands. "Whit will sign if he is alone with his fear and his God. Abram's voice is gone. Silas is too." Tyrese set down his hammer and looked at her for a long, small while. "If you walk back through that door, walk like someone whose feet belong to the ground." She did. The skiff seemed to have been waiting in the same thought Zeph had left it in. The bay wore its afternoon skin, neither glossy nor rough. A working day face. They cut along the marsh where the egrets stood like bad ideas that sometimes turn out. Rosa kept her breathing even and her face unreadable. She thought about how to ask a man to do what he did not believe he could do without losing the shape of himself. You do not ask him to be kind. You show him what fear looks like with no one to stand between it and his own eyes. When the plantation sighed into view, chimney like a lifted finger, live oaks like old men leaning on canes, Rosa felt the tightness come back, not in her hands this time, but in her chest. She put her hand over the place and pressed as if she could iron it smooth. The yard had changed only in the way a face changes after it hears bad news twice. A little more sag at the corners, a little more watchfulness at the eyes. Jonas stood near the kitchen with an empty pail he did not need. Saffron moved like weather between house and quarter. Whit sat at his desk, where a man sits when he would rather ride but the road in front of him is paper. "Rosa," he said when she stood in the doorway, and his voice did a thing a voice does when it has to speak a name it is only ever used as a tool. "Where is Abram?" "In the milk shed," she said, steady, and saw his face open and shut. He started forward, she lifted her hand. He stumbled. She left the rest unsaid, because men prefer the part of the story their minds provide to the one your mouth makes for them.
Whit put his hands on the desk to keep them from shaking. "God is
he began, and stopped. He looked toward the window where the bay light lay. God is speaking to me. He said it like a man who had discovered that God's voice sounded a lot like his own fear, given language. He is, Rosa said, because agreeing with a man's fear is the speediest way to get him to turn and face it. The child Ruthie, she put the name like a cup down between them. You said she would go with Silas inland. There is no Silas to take her. There is no Abram to make arrangements. Whit swallowed. He looked at the ledger. He looked at the door that made the front hall into a throat a person might have to pass through alone. Marianne says, he began, because men like Whit prefer their decisions to come already wrapped in woman's paper. Marianne has a fever, Rosa said, which was true, because Saffron had made it true with a gentle heat under a flannel. Ruthie is 6. She has a place in Mobile. That was not true yet, not entirely, but truth capable of being made is a useful kind. 3 nights. After that, she will have kin. Kin, Whit said, and the word let him lift his head a little because it let him imagine that the world would keep its definitions if he allowed this one thing. What do you require of me? A pass, Rosa said. One that says Ruthie may go to Mobile with me to carry linen to Mrs. Albemarle and return in 3 days. She did not add the other words that live behind the printed ones. Do not fetch the sheriff. Do not sign a sale. Do not knock the hive I have put my hand into. Whit sat down. He wrote. His pen scratched the paper like a small animal finding its way out of a trap. He held the pass out and did not meet her eyes because seeing is a kind of responsibility. Be back before Sunday, he said, as if he had brought order to the world again by setting a day on it. We will, Rosa said, though the we that would return would not include the child. She took the pass. She felt the gears of a larger thing turn 1 notch. They brought Ruthie at dusk. Zeph read the wind and made the sail do its one job in a dozen different ways. Rosa let the night cover her the way flour covers hands, not hiding the shape underneath but softening it. Back at the plantation, the house had the stiff quiet of rooms that have been corrected. Whit had put Abram in the parlor under the same sheet Silas had used, as if sameness could keep the world from seeing difference. Men from town came again. The coroner drew a new pencil line. Whit said stronger versions of the words he had said earlier, pushing them ahead of him like furniture to make a path.
Marianne lay in fever and drifted, seeing angels or flies depending on how the light hit. Saffron kept the fever where it needed to be, not so high that damage would come, and not so low that Whit would remember to ask his wife for instruction. Rosa moved in all of this like a thread that pulls a seam together without being seen. She stoked, she carried, she tasted broth and added salt. She stood where a person stands when a person expects to be asked nothing and ends up in the middle of everything. Her eyes measured doors, her hands measured rope. On the 3rd day, she stood at Whit's desk at dusk with the pass in her pocket and the knowledge that Ruthie had slept twice in the quiet house and had learned how to fold napkins into boats. Ruthie is placed, she said. She watched Whit's eyes while Whit watched his fear. She will be kin in 2 more days. Whit nodded too many times. God is, he began and stopped. He turned the paperweight on his desk as if it were a planet. I have written to Mr. Hollis about sales, he added quick, guilt mixing itself with need so thoroughly he could not taste which was which. Not Ruthie, Rosa said, and did not raise her voice because you do not win an argument with a frightened man by shouting. You will leave her to her kin. He looked at her then, finally, as if seeing that the person he called by a single name had a landscape behind her face. Why do you care, he said, meaning, why do you dare? Rosa let the silence do the first part of the work, because silence strips an argument of the armor it thinks it wears. Because I am a door, she said at last, and some doors open one way and some the other. You decide which way you will walk through me. He flinched as if the words had put a hand to the small of his back and pushed. 2 more days passed like a cart through mud, slow, stopping to pull weeds out of the wheel when necessary. In those days, news traveled faster than it had any right to. 2 Caldwell brothers dead in one house, within one day, one midnight apart. People who liked Witt said the Bay Air was an enemy. People who didn't said God had set a crosshatch on the roof and was drawing lines through a ledger. Abram's widow sent a letter that dripped. Silas's mistress sent one that burned. The minister came back with condolences varnished until they shone. And then the buggy with the sheriff's seal cut the shell road. It came at the hour when yard work has been put away and the night's work in the kitchen has not yet begun. The hour when a person might hope to stand and breathe without being noticed by anyone but the owls. The sheriff was a thick man who had taught himself to walk like a thinner one. He carried a paper that said search and a face that said opportunity. "We'll be brief," he told Witt, and then was not. He looked in rooms that did not need looking into, and in others that did but never had been looked at by anyone like him. He liked the sound his boots made on the hall floorboards. He liked asking questions in a voice that made the answers come out wrong. Rosa stepped sideways around his gaze, tucking herself into usefulness. Jonas made himself into a wall. Saffron took Marianne upstairs and gave the sheriff 3 reasons not to try the steps. In the milk shed, the sheriff stood above the churn as if it were a person on trial. He put his hand on the lid as if the lid were a truth under his palm, waiting to push up and tell him something. He lifted it. Cream looked back at him like a calm eye. "So he fell," the sheriff said, pretending to agree to see if agreement would loosen the screw he meant to turn anyway. "He fell," Witt said, gripping the edge of a lie he needed more than air. "Both my brothers were careless men." The sheriff nodded as if this was the kind of pity he could respect, the kind that kept cash in place. He put his paper away and tipped his hat, which meant he would watch the house from the road. That night, Rosa went to Mobile and brought Ruthie out of the quiet house and put her on a wagon with Tyree driving and a woman behind them whose name Ruthie would call Auntie for the rest of her life, even though that was not exactly what they were. The wagon took the narrow lane, the lane took the path to a ferry that crossed where the river thinned, the ferry took its time and passed the burden along to a road that knew where it was going.
Ruthie did not cry. She held the thread-mouthed doll like a treaty. Rosa stood at the lane's mouth and let the wagon go and did not raise her hand because raising it would let the part of her that wanted to be seen climb up on her face. She pressed her palm flat to her apron where the rope burns circled and felt the heat of it and knew it would fade in color, but not in meaning. When she turned back toward the house, the frogs started up again as if they had been waiting for her permission. Days wheeled, weeks set their shoulders. Work stitched the hours. A doctor came from town and told Witt that Marianne's fever had left her heart soft. Marianne took more rest and fewer opinions. The sheriff stopped watching from the road and watched from town, which can be worse because a distance makes all things possible. And in that loosened space, Rosa began to speak to the quarters in a different register. She did not make speeches, she taught knots. She taught how a kitchen ledger might learn to say one thing and mean 2. She taught that doors have sweet places where latches will agree not to tell the world they have been touched if you touch them just so. She taught the marsh cuts that read like cursive and the tide tables written in crane's legs. She wrote more in the sewn book. She did not write men's names unless they were the beaten or the sold. She wrote words that built a spine: knot, map, latch, swallow. She added, at last, the word learned. Witt noticed. It is a mistake to think men like Witt never notice. They do, but noticing makes them tired. One afternoon, as rain made a curtain between house and yard and the bay learned how to be many small spoons instead of one big plate, Witt stood in the kitchen doorway and watched Rosa make biscuits with the kind of focus that can survive disaster. "You run this place," he said, not bitter, not admiring, just naming a weather pattern. "I talk to God and you talk to fire, and somehow the house stands." Rosa said biscuits in rows that would make mathematical sense to a person who could count by more than pennies. "Houses stand because somebody goes to see what the hinge needs before it squeals," she said. "God talks after." He did not argue. He was learning the art of conserving his strength for fears that did not have hands he could see. Spring brought the gulls inland, and the smell of magnolia so thick it made the air feel like a thing you could fold and put away. Saffron, who always knew before anyone else, said into Rosa's dishwater one afternoon, "4 of the field hands are ready to go to ground." "Tonight?" asked Rosa. "Tomorrow," Saffron answered. "I'll move the fever into Wit for a day." She looked up from the soap. He is a manageable man when he thinks God is requiring sleep. The 4 went, 2 men with shoulders sloped by rows of cotton, and 2 women with hands that could find a splinter in a child's finger without hurting the skin. They went by the left-hand cut, following the cursive the Cranes had written. They did not come back. It would have gone on like that, a quiet exodus braided into ordinary days, if not for the thing all good plans eventually meet, a noise you cannot count for. A new overseer came with a smile that frightened the dogs. He had a scar through the eyebrow that made his face look like it had a thought in it when it didn't. He liked rope too, but only for what his kind of knowledge could make it do in open air. He counted heads at odd hours and said names like he was chewing them. He took Wit's fear and fed it gingerbread until it grew fat and opinionated. He also knew the sheriff's cousin. Within a week of his arrival, 2 men were brought back who should have been allowed to be swallows. They were dragged in wet and made to kneel under the chinaberry tree. The overseer tied their wrists high because he liked the sound a body makes when it has to choose between knees and breath. Men gathered. The yard learned a new quiet, one laced with the old one. Rosa stepped forward. She could not help it. Her body did the walking. Her mind tried to make a plan fast enough to catch up. The overseer held the rope's tail in his hand like he wanted to teach someone how to heal. "Stop," she said, not loud, but the word cut the air because it had been used sparingly in her mouth and had power from that. The overseer turned. "Who's this?" he asked Wit, who stood in the doorway absent from his spine. "She your kitchen?" "She runs the house," Wit said, before he could stop the truth. The overseer laughed. "That's so." He walked to Rosa and held the rope as if he meant to crown her with it. "You like knots?" "I like doors," Rosa said, and reached for the rope. She took it as if taking it was a kindness to the rope. She held it and looked at the 2 men kneeling. She looked at Wit. She looked back at the overseer. "And I like knowing where the sweet place is." "What sweet place?" he said, as men who cannot hear anything unless you fit it into their idea of salt and sugar always say.
"The one that makes a machine quiet," she said, and moved. She was faster than his story of her allowed. The rope went around his wrist, then the post, then his other wrist, quick, neat, a trick woven from laundry lines and boat cleats and one late hour under a milk shed beam. She stepped back and set the knot with a pull that would keep him a long minute. Men laughed, not because they loved her, but because the sound rose out of them before they could decide if it was safe. The overseer looked at his hands pinned to the post he had chosen for other people, and his mouth opened in a round O like a fish's. For one moment, the yard was a church where a different God had been invited by accident and was considering staying. Rosa turned to Wit. "Choose," she said, and put the word where it belonged. "Let these men walk to church in town with me this minute, or let them hang here until the sheriff comes and makes your yard a place where even your God won't sit." Wit chose. He chose because the laughter had scared him more than the rope. "Go," he said, voice low. "Go now." The 2 men stood like men stand when their bodies have been reminded they belong to them. Rosa cut their bindings with a kitchen knife she had carried in her apron since the day after Abram. Jonas untied the overseer slowly, because humiliation is a kind of fire you must not pour water on all at once, or it makes more smoke than you can see through. They walked down the lane in a straight line. Rosa had a pass, several, layered, some written by Wit, one written by the clerk with a pencil licked and bearing Mrs. Albemarle's calm sentences. They passed the sheriff on the road.
He tipped his hat because he was with his cousin's wife and liked to be seen as courteous in town clothes. At the church, they did not go inside. They slid past into the alley, then into the street that smelled of green wood, then into Tyree Fletcher's shop where Beryl waited with its bung out, ready to float. The men climbed into a story that had been cut to fit them by people who had never seen their faces and yet knew their sizes. When Rosa stepped back into the lane, she felt the world tilt again, 1 degree, just enough to let a new path roll downhill instead of up. She went home for the last time as a woman who lived in one house. It did not end with a gallows or a gun. It ended with an inventory of rope, of doors, of names, of maps, and with a day when Wit found his God had moved out of the front parlor and into the small space behind his heart where children's voices had once nested. He came to the kitchen and stood where men do not stand if they mean to be who they have always been. "Rosa," he said, and his voice was a man's voice made of his own timber at last. "I will sell this place. You will write first, and in the writing you will place 3 names on 3 papers that say free. You will send them to town, and you will not fetch them back with some other paper later." He looked at her and then at his hands as if he had just now remembered he had them. 3, he said. "Who?" Rosa spoke the names of people the house would not miss, because the house had never admitted it needed them. Saffron, Jonas, Zeph. She did not say her own name. A person cannot pull her own name out of a ledger without turning the table over. She was not done teaching. He wrote. Saffron took the papers to town and did not look back because looking back sometimes turns people into salt. She returned with 3 folded freedoms and eyes that had measured a new horizon. A week later, Tyree Fletcher arrived at dusk with a hoop of iron over his shoulder and something like a smile under his mustache. A place upriver needs a woman who can talk to fire. A warehouse on the edge of town needs someone who can count without being counted. A school in the colored quarter needs a night teacher who can draw letters out of ash. He said these things as if they were merely hoops that needed fitting to staves. Rosa stood in the yard that had learned her footsteps and looked up at the live oak that had stood witness without agreeing to be judge. She put her hand on the rope burn that had faded to the color of old honey. She looked at Wit and saw a man who might, in another life, have built chairs. "I will go to town," she said, "and I will live in 3 places at once. A kitchen that feeds men who lift boxes too heavy for one, a room that teaches letters so they will never be lost again, and a quay where boats bring more names than we can fit in a book. I will come back when a door needs setting, but I will not live here." No one tried to stop her. That was the measure of all she had done. In Mobile, people learned her name without saying it. They learned the sound of biscuits that rose the same every morning. They learned a woman's voice that kept time for men who had none. Children learned that letters could be doors and that the first one you open changes what all the rest look like. Ruthie grew into a girl who knew how to fold napkins and how to undo lies. She called Mrs. Albemarle Auntie and Tyree Fletcher Uncle and Rosa Mama when the dark fell deep enough. On a soft evening when the bay had more pink in it than blue, and the cathedral bell ushered the day out with the hand of a kindly usher, Rosa opened her sewn book and looked at the spine she had built: names, choice, act, movement, knot, map, latch, swallow, learned. She turned the page and wrote the last word that Saffron had once muttered into soap and water as if it were a recipe: lead. Then she closed the book and slid it into a hollow she had carved for it beneath the floorboard of the night school, a hollow smoother than breath. 2 months later, a letter arrived from Wit with a pressed magnolia petal inside, brown around the edges the way beauty ages. He wrote that he had sold the Bay Place and taken a store in town where numbers did what he told them. He wrote that he had learned to sleep without waiting for a door to open in the night with a voice in it. He did not write thank you. He did not have to. Rosa stood by the window where the swallows came and went and let the bay's old breath come into her. She looked out at a road busy with barrels and boys and women with baskets and men who had discovered they could carry only what they could lift. She put a kettle on. She trimmed a wick. She set chalk on a sill. When the next child came to the night school with a scrap of paper and a name written in it on pencil licked to a point, she smiled with the whole of her face and said, "We will begin with O, because it is a door and a mouth and a rope laid in a circle, and because it is the shape the world makes when it sees a thing it did not know it would ever have to learn." The child laughed. Outside, a gull wrote cursive across a piece of sky, and the bay held its breath and then let it out, the way a house breathes at night when the people in it finally sleep.